So you'll see the recorder thing pop up. You good?
Yes.
You see that?
Sorry. Okay. I just had to let Zoom know that I was okay with being recorded.
Okay, cool. And thank you for that. All right. So the first question I have for you, Keith. First question I have for you, Keith, is how did Star Trek inspire you?
Star Trek inspired me in a lot of different ways. I started watching it at a very young age, so it was sort of always part of my childhood. I grew up in New York City, and my parents watched the show when it first aired on NBC in the late 60s, and it was on reruns when I was growing up. And so that was how we spent every weeknight. We would, at 6 o'clock, we'd watch Star Trek, and then at 7 o'clock, we'd eat dinner. And so it was always part of the tapestry of me growing up, and it's one of the many things that got me into science fiction. And I particularly liked the fact that the default state for Star Trek was compassion. It was always, even if their initial response was violence, in the end, compassion was what won the day. Being nice to other people. They didn't always try to destroy the scary monster, because they would find out that the scary monster was in fact a mother protecting her young, or something like that. The original series in particular was what was formative, just because that's all there was when I was a kid. But that has continued throughout all the spinoffs as well. And I've always admired that and always liked that and always found that very inspiring, that the people who star in Star Trek shows and movies are people who will default to compassion, who will default to trying to help people. It's not a coincidence that so many episodes start with the ship answering a distress call. And that matters. That's important. These are heroes. These are people who help other people. And that's very inspiring.
What made you decide you wanted to write and also write Trek?
I decided to write Star Trek probably when I started reading Star Trek, because I kept watching the same 79 episodes over and over again, and I wanted more, and the novels and comic books provided that. I started reading James Blish's adaptations, and then moved on to the original novels that were published. Throughout all of high school, I was devouring Star Trek novels from Simon & Schuster and the Star Trek comic books from DC Comics. And I always thought, and I always wanted to be a writer anyhow. The desire to write has been there since I was at least 6. So it was being able to be one of the people who wrote Star Trek novels was something that was a dream of mine going back to when I started reading Star Trek novels. And then I went and did it. So it all worked out.
Well, how did that come about? And can you talk a bit about the Starfleet Corps of Engineers?
Those are two separate answers. I got drawn into, I always wanted to write Star Trek fiction, and my ability to do so was aided by being friends with the editor. Having said that, being friends with the editor only mattered once I had established myself professionally. I was friends with John Ordover back when he worked at Tor Books, back in around 1990 or so is when we met. And in 1993, I want to say, 94 or something like that, it was 94, he moved over to Simon & Schuster and became one of the editors of Star Trek fiction. He was working alongside Kevin Ryan at the time. But he did not invite me to pitch Star Trek to him until after I'd already sold and written 4 novels. I'd already written a Spider-Man novel, 2 Buffy the Vampire Slayer novel, and 2 Young Hercules novels. And then at that point, John said, "Hey, want to write a Star Trek novel?" And I said, "Yes!" So I pitched something to him, which he rejected. And then he turned around. This was in 1999, and he had just gotten in the script for the final Deep Space Nine episode, What You Leave Behind. And he said, "Okay, so the last DS9 episode's coming up, and it ends with Worf going off to become Federation ambassador for the Klingon Empire. How'd you like to write Worf's first adventure in that role?" And since Worf is one of my 2 favorite characters in Star Trek, along with Kira Nerys, I said, oh, hell yeah. So that was how that came about. I also, when I was developing Diplomatic Plausibility, I also started talking to Marco Palmieri, who had come on as one of the Star Trek editors as well by that point. Kevin had long since moved on, and both Margaret Clark and Marco Palmieri had come on to join John in editing Trek fiction at that point. And Marco was in the process of developing the post-finale Deep Space Nine novels, and he wanted to know if I wanted to be a part of it, because he had liked my other work, and so that happened also. And those both, and hilariously, the Deep Space Nine novel I did focus a lot on Kira. So my first two full-length Star Trek novels got to focus on my two favorite characters, which is great. John Ordover called me in June of 2000 and said, Microsoft just did a deal with us to do original ebook novellas to tie into their new Microsoft Reader. This was before the Kindle. This was this is when ebooks could only really be read on your computer, basically. But Microsoft was launching in June of 2000 their e-reader, and one of the things they wanted on it was exclusive Star Trek content. So John and I basically, over a weekend, because this was all like happening at once, we had to like slam this all into production as quickly as possible. We conceived the Starfleet Corps of Engineers series. We figured that would be an appropriate group of characters to focus on for something that was available exclusively as an electronic book, something that was, the tech geeks of the Star Trek universe. So John and I both, put our heads together and started coming up, and it was John's idea to make sure it wasn't just technical people, that this was a mobile team of problem solvers. And while most of them would be engineers of your LaForges and your Scotties and your O'Briens and your Nog types, and your Torreses and your Stamets and your Tuckers, but also that there would be a cultural specialist and a linguist, which John thought was important because sometimes you need to, be able to read the writing that's on this alien machine that's out of control that you need to fix or whatever, which proved very useful and really made the series work better. It was my idea to bring in the characters we brought in from the TV show: Sonia Gomez, Kieran Duffy, Fabian Stevens, and Elizabeth Lenz. And then between us, John and I created all the original characters. And it was great fun and very harrowing, because, like I said, this was all a big major rush job. So we John and I put together the Bible over a weekend, and me and Dean Wesley Smith and Christy Golden wrote the first three, and we had like a couple weeks to write full novellas with new characters that we had just created. So it was John's idea to use somebody from the animated series, a species from the animated series. Originally, we wanted to use Bem from David Gerrold's Bem, but unfortunately, that there were rights issues with that. It was complicated, so we instead went with the Pillbug that M3 Green was. We named them the Nasat and created a new character. Who was a giant pillbug like M3 Green from the episode Jihad, and then it was my idea to include a Binar. Originally, I wanted a Binar pairing. It was John's idea to have one of the Binars get killed and our Binar decide to be solo, which made that Binar an outcast from Binar society, because it's Star Trek and we like having our outcast characters. So that was tremendous fun. We after those first three with the launch of Microsoft Reader, then in 2001, that launched in the summer of 2000. In 2001, we launched a monthly ebook series, which continued until 2008. The ebook line was, it was canceled in 2007, like a couple of months before the Sony e-reader and the Kindle debuted. So like the timing was terrible, but they canceled it because there wasn't enough interest in ebooks at the time. If we just waited one more year, but it was great fun to do it. We did about 75 ebooks mostly Starfleet Corps of Engineers. Plus, we did 2 miniseries. We did an original series miniseries called Mere Anarchy for the show's 40th anniversary in 2006, and then Slings and Arrows for Next Generation's 20th anniversary in 2007. And it was great. I'm really proud of the work we did. I was the editor in charge of that, and I got to write for all of it as well. And I really enjoyed it. It was I miss it. It was I think we did some really good stories there.
I love those characters. I loved those stories. I miss them as well. If only we could convince somebody higher up to bring them back.
Yeah,
let's do it. Let's do it. I don't know.
I have to convince them to hire me first. But, you know.
Well, there's that too. Yes, we'll work on this. How do you find the character's voice so well when you're writing your books?
I just listen to them. You know, I couldn't tell you how I do it. You know, it's like asking me how I have brown hair. It's a skill that I seem to have. I pay attention to how the characters talk, you know, watching them and listening to them. And then every time I give them a line of dialogue, I try to filter it through the voice of the actor in question, you know, and that's just what I try to do. I mean, there was one of the ebooks. I wrote the last book in the Slings and Arrows ebook series, which was a Next Generation Deep Space Nine crossover that paired up Picard and Sisko for the first time since Emissary, because it never happened on screen. But in the fiction, we are not constrained by actor availability, so we can do stuff like that. And I wanted to put Picard and Sisko together, working together as equals rather than in the more contentious relationship they had in Emissary. So there was one line of dialogue which I'd originally had Picard say, and then I realized that no, Sisko needs to be the one to say this, and I completely rewrote the sentence with almost completely different words because Avery Brooks talks differently from the way Patrick Stewart talks. And that, you know, you can't just swap lines out like that. You have to keep it in the voice of that character. So that it's a fun thing to do, and it's not always easy, but it's worthwhile. It's what makes good media tie-in fiction work, is if you can hear the characters' voices. I actually taught a workshop back in 2004, I think, specifically on how to write media tie-in fiction. And one of the exercises I gave them was to take Kirk's "Risk is our business" speech from Return to Tomorrow and give the speech the way one of the other Star Trek captains would have given it. And I got some great stuff out of it. It was tremendous fun seeing how Picard would have given that speech, how Janeway would have given that speech, how Sisko would have given that speech, how Archer would have given that speech. One person actually did how Calhoun from the New Frontier series would have written it, which was great. So that was nifty. And that's an important part of doing this kind of fiction, is being able to match the voices. But I mean, the way I do it is just by paying attention.
Okay, no, that's cool. You remind me of the big frustration I had with Enterprise. If Archer's speech is so amazing that he gives, that just changes everything, we never heard it. So I'm always thinking about, what did he say?
Yeah, that was kind of a cop-out, but
yeah. You do amazing reviews for Tor.com. You were reviewing Picard as that was airing, and you're now doing a rewatch for Voyager. And most of the time, that's cool. Sometimes I'm sorry for you. How did you get this job? And has writing these reviews changed your perspective, especially on Voyager?
What happened was Tor.com did a rewatch of the original series back in 2010, I want to say. It was originally by Eugene Myers and Tori Atkinson. They did the first 2 seasons, and then they left, and Tor hired David Mack and Dayton Ward, 2 of my fellow Trek scribes, to do the 3rd season. They did that. They enjoyed it, but the obvious next step was to move on to the Next Generation. But because there are so many more episodes of Next Generation, it really needed to be a twice-a-week thing. And Dayton and Dave really didn't have the time to commit to that. So they suggested that I do it instead. for which I'm extremely grateful to them, because I've become one of the main writers at Tor.com in the 9 years since then. This is in 2011 that I started the Next Generation rewatch. I went through Next Generation. I decided, why not? Let's just move on to Deep Space Nine. Then I actually went back and did the original series, because it had been a few years since the original series rewatch that they did, and I wanted to go through that as well, and also include the animated series as well as all the original series movies. We covered the Next Gen movies also, and that rewatch. And then once I was done with the original series, and I also did a couple of other rewatches for Tor. I did a seasonal rewatch of the Stargate franchise, and then I also did an episode, well, a story by story, not episode by episode rewatch of the 1966 Batman TV show, which was called Holy Rewatch Batman. And then I did an extensive overview of all the live action movies based on superhero comic books. The reason why I did all that other stuff is that the obvious next step after Deep Space Nine would have been Voyager, but I didn't want to do Voyager. I didn't like Voyager as much. I love the original series, Next Gen and Deep Space Nine. I'm less enthusiastic about Voyager, and if it comes to that, Enterprise. Once Star Trek Discovery launched, Tor asked me to review those episodes as they came out. And that's been an ongoing thing. Every time there's been a new episode of Discovery, of Short Treks, and of Picard, I have reviewed it. And that's going to continue with Discovery Season 3, whenever that debuts, as well as, whatever new Short Treks there are, Picard Season 2, the 2 new animated series that they're developing, and so on. And then as I was winding down the superhero movie rewatch, I was trying to figure out, okay, what can I do next? And I was thinking about it, and a lot of people whose opinions I respect were confused as to why I didn't like Voyager, and were disappointed. These are all mostly women, mostly who are younger than me, who grew up watching Voyager, and they grew up with Captain Janeway as one of their idols, and who really enjoyed the show and really liked the show and thought I should give it another shot. So I did, and I'm liking it more than I expected to, partly because part of what disappointed me about Voyager when it first aired was that it never really embraced its premise, to my mind. Paramount spent all of 1994 telling us that they were doing this new show that was going to put a Starfleet crew and a Maquis crew being forced to work together to get home while stranded 70,000 light years from Earth. And then the show happened, and we got none of that. I mean, we got the stranded 70,000 years mark. The conflict between the Starfleet and Maquis crew, which was the cornerstone of the marketing for the show, didn't happen. And on top of that, it was airing simultaneously with the 3rd season forward of Deep Space Nine, which was just brilliant. And Voyager just didn't really hold up side by side with it, to my mind. Watching it now, 25 years later, knowing that they're not going to embrace their premise, knowing that not watching it at the same time that I'm watching Deep Space Nine, I'm more favorably inclined toward it. There are still issues with it, but there's a lot of good about it as well. I'm particularly enjoying the character of Janeway. I am enjoying the character of B'Elanna Torres, Tuvok and Kes. I'm enjoying a great deal as well. I like the fact that Janeway is a science nerd, and I like the fact that you see Janeway and Torres getting together and having the same type of nerdy conversations that are usually between male characters. This is a show that passes the Bechdel test of very regularly of female characters talking to each other about something other than a man, which Voyager and Deep Space Nine are the only Trek shows that pass that on a regular basis. Well, Discovery does also, but it's. So that's mostly what I'm getting. I'm only in the 2nd season. As we record this, I just did the episode Prototype, which is about halfway through season 2. So I've still got a long way to go, and there's still lots of Voyager left to go. And I'll be curious to see how it continues and what my take on it is as it goes along.
Well, and I have to say I'm enjoying reading those. And then going back, and actually I've been watching some of them again after I've read your reviews, because I don't remember this one at all.
Yeah.
So I'm loving it. So thank you. I'm having fun following those. I hope you do Enterprise.
One thing,
just for the record.
One thing I want to mention also.
Yeah.
One thing I want to mention. One of the things that I didn't know at the time and that has come out in the years since, and it's seriously affected my viewing of it. In the native consultant that Voyager used for the character of Chakotay was a fake. He was not actually native. He went by the name Jamaki Highwater, but his real name was Jackie Marks, and he was a Jewish guy from Los Angeles who had no native blood in him at all. And watching the portrayal of Chakotay is cringe-inducing right now. It was unfortunately of its time. The 90s was a time when there was a great deal of overcorrecting of the portrayal of indigenous people. It had been for so long horrible. The original series has a perfect, terrible example of it in, oh God, I'm blanking on the title. The one with the obelisk in Miramani. The
Paradise Syndrome.
Thank you. The Paradise Syndrome, let me start that again. The original series had a terrible example of it in the Paradise Syndrome with, writing native peoples as if they were not too bright 5-year-olds who need white people to come in and show them cool things like irrigation and gourds, which was typical of portrayals of indigenous peoples in the 60s. In the 90s, there was a bit of an overcorrection to try to portray them as good and noble people who were one with the land and the purest example of humanity, which is in its way just as patronizing and as annoying as the negative portrayals were 30 years earlier. So watching the way Chakotay is portrayed generally, and particularly the episode Tattoo, and knowing now that the guy they had consulting on these matters was talking out of his ass, that's unfortunate. And it's very cringe-inducing. So that's been an interesting perspective on it, looking back on it 25 years later.
I had no idea about that. That is that's awesome. Yeah.
By the way, that's part of why I'm doing Voyager now also. This year, 2020 is the 25th anniversary of the show. So that was part of what inspired me to reconsider my decision to not do Voyager. And so I'm doing it now. And probably when I'm done, I will do Enterprise, only because if I don't, it'll be the only one I won't have covered on the site. Because, I've covered every episode of Discovery, Short Treks, and Picard. I've done rewatches of all the other shows, or I will have by the time I'm done with Voyager. So it seems silly to not do Enterprise at that point. So I probably
will. Well, I hope so, because like I said, I'm enjoying reading them a bunch. Is there some aspect of Star Trek that you wish that you had written up to this point?
Oh God. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of stories still to be told. I've been the one thing in particular that has come up for me recently is Discovery's portrayal of Klingons and of the history of Klingons that they've added to in the era between Enterprise and the original series. I'm genuinely curious to see, and I would love to write more about what the Klingon culture is, what Klingon stuff has been going on in the earlier part of the 23rd century. I've written a lot of fiction based on the Klingons and would love to write more, both in the Discovery era, in the era between Enterprise and Discovery, and also in the Picard era, in the post-Nemesis era. I was interested in that before Picard debuted, and would still, and I had written some, post-Nemesis Klingon fiction, but not that much, and I would have liked to have done more, and still would. There's lots of characters I would love to explore more of. The character of Kestra, the daughter of William Riker and Deanna Troi, is a wonderful character who I would love to. I hope we get to see more of her moving forward, and I would love to. That's a character I'd love to write fiction based on. And so on. There's lots of stuff. I'd love to do more original series stuff. I've done very little with the original series. One novella, really, in the first half of the Brave and the Bold book one, is really the only straight original series story I've done, which wasn't by choice. It's just the way things worked out. I would love to do a straight up original series story, which I haven't done. I'd love to do more stuff with some of the DS9 characters and the Aventine characters, which I helped develop in A Singular Destiny, and so much more. So there's lots of stuff. Yeah.
I'd love to. Well, fingers crossed. I want to read these. So you love Star Trek, but I have to ask, what's your favorite series? And of that series, what is your favorite episode?
My favorite Star Trek series is probably Deep Space Nine, with the caveat that I also love the original series and Next Generation a great deal. But I thought DS9 brought everything together beautifully, and it's partly because it built on what the original series and Next Generation established. DS9 could not have existed in a vacuum, and the reason why it was so successful is because of what was already established on the two previous shows. And for that matter, one of its ongoing things was something it established for the next show, which was the Maquis conflict, which was created specifically to set up Voyager, which DS9 actually did more with than Voyager did. It had the most interesting ensemble. It did the most character development. It did a great deal of interesting storytelling work, of moving things forward, of upending the status quo, of challenging people's assumptions, and still, with all that, was true to Star Trek's hallmark. It didn't trash the Federation's utopia; it challenged it. But in the end, it still came out on top. As I've said before, Star Trek's hallmark has been compassion, and even Deep Space Nine, it went at the end of the war. The Dominion War, which had been going on for 2 seasons, didn't end because of military strategy. It didn't end by bombarding the crap out of the bad guy. It ended because Odo did a compassionate thing. Because Odo said, I will go back to the Great Link with you and I will cure this disease that was given to you. And that's what stops the war, which again is another prototypical Star Trek thing. And that was how Deep Space Nine ended their biggest story arc. It also did a very good job of balancing ongoing storylines with individual stories. Each story was a discrete unit, but it also embraced serialization. And I think it struck a much better balance than a lot of shows that have tried it have done. So that would be that. As far as favorite episode, probably my favorite episode of Deep Space Nine is Tacking Into the Wind, which was part of the story arc that ended the Dominion War. But it had 2 concurrent plot lines, one involving Kira and the Cardassian resistance with Damar and Garak and Odo and Rasat. And the other thread was Gowron doing insane military strategies and Worf trying to rein him in, eventually to the point where he challenges him and kills him. What I love about that episode, it's most episodes that people would list as the best Star Trek episodes are ones that mostly stand on their own. Things like The Trouble with Tribbles, or City on the Edge of Forever, or Yesterday's Enterprise, or The Visitor, or Jetrel, or Judgment. Episodes that work on their own as an episode and don't really require much by way of backstory. Even The Best of Both Worlds only requires a little bit of backstory, but it mostly stands on its own also. Tacking Into the Wind very much does not, but that's its strength, because it ties up 2 ongoing storylines that have been part of 2 different TV shows for over a decade. The Kira plotline brings together the Cardassia-Bajor conflict that was first introduced in season 5 of Next Generation on the Ensign Rowe episode, and which has been part of the texture of Deep Space Nine throughout its entire run, and brings it all together beautifully in Kira leading the Cardassian resistance and the way that particular storyline comes to an end there. And the plot with Worf and Gowron is the ongoing Klingon political arc, which was the closest Next Generation had to an ongoing story arc, starting in Sins of the Father in the 3rd season and going all the way through to Rightful Heir in the 6th season, and then continuing on Deep Space Nine with The Way of the Warrior, and when Worf joined the cast of Deep Space Nine, and continuing all through the last 4 years of Deep Space Nine as well. So, and that all tied together too. So this was the culmination of a decade's worth of stories on 2 different TV shows, and it all came together beautifully. Everything was just so perfect in that episode. And I absolutely love that for that reason.
That's a great summary of a great episode. I like that, and thank you. So I'm curious on what your thoughts are, because when DS9 was on, it was sort of underappreciated, and now it's beloved by us. But why do you think it was underappreciated at the time?
It wasn't. I mean, I think the underappreciated thing is overstated. It was not as popular as The Next Generation, but that's a hard bar to clear anyway. Next Generation worked on, it hit the audience at just the right time, at a time when there was no other science fiction worth mentioning on the air. And it blazed the trail for A, more science fiction on television, and B, first run syndicated drama, which was a brand new way of releasing new TV shows. Prior to Next Generation, the only things that were done in first run syndication were game shows. And then it opened the door to a whole bunch of syndicated TV shows. You had Babylon 5, you had Star Trek, you had, not Star Trek, Time Tracks, you had Highlander, you had Hercules and Xena. So all these shows that were released in first run syndication, and it was because of Next Generation's popularity. DS9 was never going to match that. Having said that, it's still, a lot of people still watched it. Yes, it wasn't as popular as Next Generation, but it was still popular. And also, it was bound to be less numerically popular because it wasn't traditional Star Trek. Even Deep Space Nine changed the meaning of what Star Trek could be. Prior to Deep Space Nine, Star Trek meant these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. It could be Kirk's Enterprise, it could be Picard's Enterprise. If you wanted to get crazy, it could be Pike's Enterprise or Garrett's Enterprise, but it was still the Enterprise. DS9 was the first TV show and the first screen version of Star Trek that broke that mold, and that changed everything. That allowed Voyager and Discovery and Picard to happen because it broke the mold. It meant that you didn't have to be about a spaceship called Enterprise in order to be Star Trek anymore. But that's, when you change things like that, not everyone's going to be along for the ride. Some people are going to want, the safer, more standard, expected version. So I think that's a big source of why it was not as popular when it first aired. Having said that, it's also one that has aged well. I mean, I was rewatching Deep Space Nine from 2013 to 2015, and it was just as good as it was at the time. It has survived the intervening 20, 30 years intact. It's still a good show. The writing is still strong. TV itself has embraced serialization in a way that it hadn't at the time DS9 was on the air, and I think that was part of the problem too. Aside from Hill Street Blues and soap operas, and airing at the same time, Babylon 5, there weren't that many TV shows that were embracing the level of serialization that DS9 did, and not everybody was necessarily on board for that. And I think part of why there's a greater appreciation for it now is because the audience is used to that now. So, and also, just in general, every single time there's a new Star Trek, it engenders interest in the old Star Trek. When the first Bad Robot movie came out in 2009, there was a spike in DVD sales of all the previous series, and there was a spike in the novels and comics book sales too. And then when Discovery launched, same thing. And now with CBS All Access, you have and between that and Netflix, you can get any of them, right there. So that's helped too, just the easy availability.
Well, you lead me to my last question for you is, what do you see as the future of the franchise, especially with Discovery and Picard opening it up to a new generation of fans?
There's no limit. I like the fact that CBS and Secret Hideout are committed to doing a whole bunch of different Star Trek shows. I think their goal is to have there be a new Star Trek on the air every week forever. Which is great. The world is open to so many different possibilities. The future history that was created for this show by Gene Roddenberry in 1964 is open to so many story possibilities. You know, we've already seen, you know, we've got more Discovery. Picard is opening up the 24th century, and both those shows have given us glimpses of things that could also work on their own as spin-offs of this, whether it's, you know, Anson Mount's Christopher Pike on the Enterprise with Ethan Peck and Rebecca Romijn, which rumors are that that's going to happen, although there's nothing confirmed. But that's an obvious possibility. The Riker and Troy on Picard, 7 of 9, and the Fenris Rangers from Picard. There's just so many things. Yeah, what are the other 24th century characters up to now? You know, which would depend on which actors are willing to come back. But there's so many. You know, what's the, you know, the more exploration of the Romulan Empire? What are the Klingons up to 25 years after Nemesis? What are and so many other things. There's so much stuff out there. And they're already starting to develop it. I know there's going to be the Section 31 series. There's the 2 animated series that are being developed, the Lower Decks, and another one for Nickelodeon. The sky's the limit, to quote a certain Enterprise captain when he finally joined the poker game. And I'm really heartened to see that CBS and Secret Hideout are committed to exploring as much of that sky as they can.
I love that, and I would love to see new Star Trek every week, guaranteed. I'd be in front of my TV. This is the essay portion of the the questions. Could you do the Space: The Final Frontier, and then when you're done, do a Live Long and Prosper for me?
Okay, those are 2 separate things you want, right? So I should pause between them?
Yes, please.
Okay. Let's need a little more coffee. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Her ongoing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Peace and long life, live long and prosper.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Hang on.
One take DeCandido, that's what they call me.
Hang on, I'll stop recording here, and then I'll...